Welcome, everybody. Welcome to one of our first book talks of the current academic year. And we have a very special guest who is Dori Jones-Yang. And Dori was a SAIS student and studied about China. But she graduated in 1980, just a year or two before we actually had a China Studies program. And for those of you who don't know her background, she went on from SAIS to be a journalist. She was hired by Businessweek and sent to be a foreign correspondent in Hong Kong, where she then became one of the youngest bureau chiefs, or the youngest foreign bureau chief at Businessweek. Dori was in Hong Kong and covered China throughout the 1980s, throughout a period of tremendous change and tumult in China. And that is a lot of what her book is about. And I don't want to say too much about that, but let me say Dori went on to have a very successful career after Hong Kong as a journalist, and then as an author. She's written a number of books, and one of them is an early story of Starbucks and how that became so successful. She's made her home in Seattle since the 1990s. And we are really happy to have her here today. She's written this book, which is both a memoir and it's both personal and professional. It is a memoir. I think you will find it a very interesting combination that is just a pleasure to read. So before I turn it over to Dori, I'd like to just say a personal note, which is that both Dori and I have many common threads in our lives, and we first met when we were both working in Hong Kong in the early 1980s. Although we didn't then spend a lot of time in the same place, we do have many common friends and experiences. One of those is that we both cut our teeth professionally at the U.S.-China Business Council, which was at that time called the National Council for U.S.-China Trade. So it is really a special pleasure for me to turn over the platform to Dori Jones-Yang, and it'll bring back lots of memories, I'm sure, to hear what you have to say. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madeline. It's a real joy for me to be able to talk to you today from Seattle. I was hoping that I could get to Washington, D.C. to have a chance to meet with everybody in person. But through the magic of Zoom, I can talk to you today and give you a little bit of background about my book. So first, I wanted to just tell you a little bit about the book, and then Madeline and I'll have a conversation, and we encourage you to put questions in chat either now or later as we speak. So I'm going to share the screen now and give you a little bit of background about who I am. A few of you know me, but a lot of you don't. And a little bit of background about what the book is about. So the book is called When the Red Gates Opened, a memoir of China's reawakening. It was just published a few weeks ago. And it is both, as Madeline said, it is both a personal and a historical memoir. So one of the things I tried to do is to tell my own story, even some personal things about my story as being a young journalist at the time, and I met and married my husband while I was living in Hong Kong. So it's an individual story, but set in a larger time frame of China and Hong Kong during a really, what I consider a pivotal time in recent history. And I think obviously it's not a scholarly work, but I think it will appeal pretty broadly to people who, perhaps the same kind of people who read historical fiction, who get really drawn into a story because of the personal story that's going on, but then learn a lot about the time and place. So the actual book and my connection with China goes back to 1978, 79. And I was a student at SAIS. And during the time, this was incredibly fortunate timing, that when Deng Xiaoping came to Washington, D.C. and other cities in the U.S., and Jimmy Carter, and Deng had just reestablished diplomatic relations. And in January of 79, when he came to Washington, they held a big gala performance at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. And I was working at the Trade Council at the time, and we got some free seats in the back row, and I was able to be there at that amazing moment. And it turns out to be a very fortunate timing for me, because I had been very interested in journalism and very interested in China. So my background in journalism was that I grew up in Ohio. My dad was a bookseller in Ohio. That's my first job at age 11. And he was the one who encouraged me to go into journalism. So I first started working during college summers at my local newspaper, the Youngstown Vindicator, and I worked 2 summers in Washington for a newspaper as well during college, and also spent a lot of time on the newspaper at Princeton, the Daily Princetonian. And so I was really set on a career in journalism. And then later, when I was a grad student at SAIS, I got a job as Madeline mentioned, at the National Council for U.S.-China Trade, as it was called then. And because I had a background in journalism, I wrote articles for the China Business Review, which Madeline later edited. So that was my background in journalism. But I also had a background in China. When I was in college, it didn't occur to me to study Chinese or to study about China, but I loved foreign languages. And right after I graduated, I got a fellowship to spend 2 years in Singapore. And part of it was to study Mandarin Chinese 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, which for an American is really the best way to learn a language, or learn Chinese in particular. As many of you who are Americans who've studied Chinese know this. It's a very difficult language for English speakers to learn, and it was great preparation. And it got me interested in China, but it got me interested in the Chinese language, but I realized I didn't know much about China itself. And actually at that time, frankly, most Americans didn't know much about contemporary China. So I came to SAIS specifically because I wanted to learn about China, and of course studied international economics as well. And that ended up being a great background, not just to cover China, but to cover business in China. So right after I graduated, it was very fortuitous timing, because major newspapers and magazines throughout the United States were very eager to hire people with a background in journalism in China, and there weren't very many of us. So I got a job with Businessweek, and they moved me to New York, and I worked there for a while. They trained me up for about 1.5 years, and then they sent me to Hong Kong in 1982 to be bureau chief. And at that time, Businessweek covered China out of Hong Kong, because they considered a place important depending on how much trade was done. It may be hard to believe, but Hong Kong and Taiwan did far more trade with the US than China did. And China in 1982, some of you who are old timers will know what it looked like, and many of you younger people will only know from pictures. But there were still, it was a time of transition, and there was still a lot of signs of Maoism. There were statues of Mao in almost every big city, and there were political banners on the street. And although they weren't as heavily oriented towards class struggle, and then there were, when you look at these street scenes, it's kind of amazing for anybody who knows China today that there were quite a few bicycles and not many cars, and people dressed very plainly. And the color picture is a picture I took during my first actual reporting trip to China in 1982, and shows some farmers selling their produce, which seems like a very ordinary thing to most of us. But at that time, no one was allowed, previous to that time, no one was allowed to go into business in any way. And right around then, of course, the Deng's reform started in the countryside, and people could start, they were like allowed to plant what they wanted and to come into the city and sell things. So it was just a period of time when they were starting to turn the corner towards more private enterprise. And a big, big story that I covered as a journalist was the future of Hong Kong, the discussions about the future of Hong Kong. Just a few months after I arrived, the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher flew to Beijing for her first trip there and met with Deng Xiaoping and other Chinese leaders to begin discussions about the future. And she thought that because Britain's lease expired in 1997, that she would be able to get an extension on the lease, which, as we know, is not what happened. And there was a lot of really nervousness in Hong Kong at the time because of this. And so my very first cover story was about the future of Hong Kong. And for a magazine reporter, that's the big deal, is to get a cover story. So when I got this, when I wrote this cover story, which focused on business, so Hong Kong Bank, which was a big British company, and the Bank of China, the biggest bank in China at the time, I was talking a little bit about their rivalry, each building tall buildings in Hong Kong at the time. And the magazine ran this picture of me next to the Bank of China lion, kind of to show that the magazine was paying a lot of attention to Hong Kong and China at the time. About a year after I arrived, I met this good-looking Chinese guy named Paul Yang and started seeing him. And just a month after we started seeing each other, and this is the man who became my husband, that's why I have a Chinese last name, even though I don't have a Chinese face. Just a month after I met him, he took me to Taiwan to meet his parents, which was kind of amazing to me. Paul was born in China, and his parent in mainland China, his father was with the Kuomintang. He was with Chiang Kai-shek's government. And so in 1949, they fled to Taiwan. Very familiar story to many, many families. And so my husband grew up, spent his high school and college years in Taiwan, and then came to the US for graduate school in the 60s. So by the time I met him, he was already a US citizen, a Chinese American, but his parents still lived in Taiwan. So when he took me to visit, it was really kind of magical for me because it was the first time that I was really inside a Chinese family, speaking Mandarin to them. I was pretty fluent at the time and able to communicate with them. And it was a great experience. At the same time in the 80s, people like Paul's family had the chance to reconnect with relatives in the mainland. They had been cut off from relatives for 30 years, didn't know if their relatives were alive or dead. And so Paul was able to go to see his relatives. The picture on the left, me with that fox fur hat, is with one of his uncles. It's in a very small village in Hebei province where his mother grew up. And so I had a chance, it was really kind of a privilege is the way I looked at it, to see a part of China that foreign reporters didn't generally in those days get a chance to see, which was a rural village. The pictures on the right, his father's family came from Lianyungang on the coast, halfway between Beijing and Shanghai. And the older woman next to me is his half-sister, who was 15 years older. So she was engaged to be married at the time that his family fled. So she didn't leave. She stayed in China, and she suffered a great deal. And it was really getting to know her and her family and some of the suffering that they'd had during some of the political campaigns in the 50s and 60s and 70s that I really came to appreciate what Deng Xiaoping's reforms were doing for ordinary people. In 1985, I had my first cover story about China. And we called it Capitalism in China. And some people criticized me at the time and said, oh, it was too euphoric and too overblown. I mean, that I was exaggerating and way too hopeful about the changes that were happening in China. But it was at the time, the whole 80s really were a time of hope and optimism and even sometimes euphoria. You can see this woman is not dressed in the typical black and white outfits that a lot of the other people were wearing in China at that time. People had access to consumer goods and they were able to go into business for themselves if they wanted, and they could make decisions about their own economic life. At the same time, during the 80s, the foreign journalists were fairly limited in where they could go, at least for reporting. And every time I went into China to do a trip to several different cities, it was very hard to travel around China, to make travel arrangements. So I had to have a minder basically from the Communist Party. But I was there, and she arranged everything, and she went with me, and she was there to interpret. She was fluent in English, but most of the interviews I did in Chinese anyway. But she also would write a report about me at the end of every trip. And so, but the interesting thing in my particular case is that we became friends. So that she was a woman of about my age. We were rooting for different teams, but we ended up being friends. Someone asked me about my favorite person that I ever interviewed there, and it's very hard to say because I interviewed so many interesting people. But some of you may recognize Professor Li Yining, who is a Beijing University professor, and he was known as Mr. Stock Market. And it's hard now to realize just what a mind-boggling experience it was to read that China was opening a stock market, because there's nothing more capitalist than a stock market where individuals can own shares in companies. And he was the one who pushed it. And I interviewed him, and I got to know him personally a little bit. The highlight of my career as a journalist was Tiananmen Square. And it started in April, May of '89, and I was a reporter on the square and interviewing people, and it was a time of discontent, of course, but it was also, I think a lot of people now looking back don't realize, a lot of Americans remember the television coverage, but they don't recall just the amazing openness and sense of freedom that people had during the 6 weeks of the protest. Over the course of the 80s, early in the 80s, Chinese people were a little bit afraid to talk to a foreign reporter. And in May of '89, people were speaking openly and telling me about what they thought, and then actually talking to each other about their views on politics in a very open setting. And so there was initially this sense of excitement and hope in the square, although there was a sense of menace as well. And then, of course, in June of 1989, the Chinese army came in and used live ammunition to stop the protests. And there was a great sense of despair. And this was the cover story that I wrote then, The Great Leap Backward. And we all thought, at least many of us, certainly I thought, and my husband thought, that it was all over in China, that the reform was over, the U.S.-China business connections were over, that was it. U.S.-China relations were at a very, very bad point at that time. And I didn't want to cover China anymore. I thought some of the people I had gotten to know would get into trouble. So it was in 1990 that we decided to return to the United States. So we decided to move to Seattle. And I haven't been covering China since then, but that was the reason that I moved back. Many of you have seen this graph of the views of China by typical American people. And The blue line is the unfavorable views, and it's just been going up and up in the last few years. It took me about 6 years to write this book. So you can see 6 years ago, the situation was a little bit different. It was quite a bit different. And in the last few years, the opinions of China by Americans have gotten very negative. And from what I understand, the opinions of America in China have also gotten very negative. So just a few themes that run through my book. One is that journalists' predictions are often wrong. It's very humbling to be a journalist in some ways because there's written evidence of your lack of foresight. We're often pushed to make predictions. I wrote that from now on, in 1990, it seemed that China would be moving backward. Obviously, anybody who knows anything about China from 1990 on knows that that was dead wrong. It is the opposite that happened. Another thing is that China looks very different from the inside. Many of you already know that. And as a journalist, I found it a little bit frustrating sometimes to really try to convey the full nuance and complexity of what I saw. I was being pushed to make generalizations and not give that full complexity. And I think it's really important what all of you are doing. And I really hope that there will be continued exchanges of American students going to China and Chinese students coming to this country, because I believe it's very important to try to see what the world looks like through their eyes, for Americans to try to understand what it looks like to China. And also, I bring a kind of a historical perspective that there have been a lot of ups and downs, even in my lifetime, in U.S.-China relations. And it's a pretty depressing time in U.S.-China relations. I would really love to end on a note of hope, although there's reason for discouragement at the moment. And I found this quote in John Pomfret's wonderful book about U.S.-China relations. And he talks about both the U.S. and China experience rapturous enchantment, begetting hope, followed by disappointment, repulsion, and disgust, only to return to fascination once again. And I can only hope that that the ups and downs that we've seen, there was certainly rapturous enchantment when I was there, and followed by repulsion after Tiananmen Square, and then enchantment yet again. And now we're back in a phase of disappointment. And I hope that the circle will turn again. So that's really in a nutshell, what my book is about. And so it's called When the Red Gates Open. And I'm looking forward to your questions. So I'll stop the share right now. And I think Madeline has some questions, but we also encourage you to either use the Q&A function or the chat. Which do you prefer, Madeline?
I'm going to ask people to put their questions in the Q&A. And we have lots of SAIS students on this call, and I hope that they will take advantage of the chance to ask a question from an alum. And so we already have some questions coming in, but I'm going to use my prerogative to get started. And my challenge is figuring out which of the questions I want to ask you. But since we're here at SAIS and the students are studying economics and China, most of them on this call, would you just say a little bit more about the business climate when you were there? Your book describes some pretty tough business situations for American business. So it wasn't all euphoria in the early days. And then obviously there's been a bit of a roller coaster in recent years. Businesses have been strong supporters of US-China relations, but not so much now. There's a bit of a change. So I just wonder what your perspective is on what you observed in the 80s and what you're seeing now.
Well, great. That's a good question. Well, first of all, my SAIS preparation, I have to say, was amazing for the career that I picked, because not only did I learn a lot about China, but I also, as you point out, learned a lot about international economics. And as a business reporter, particularly economic development, China is a really interesting case in economic development, as are other countries in Southeast Asia and what we used to call the Four Tigers. And it gave me a context for understanding what I was seeing in China and what I had seen in other countries. As you mentioned, when I was covering U.S. business in China, I went and visited a lot of businesses, joint venture businesses in different parts of China, the very earliest pioneers. And it was a frustrating climate for them. It was very difficult for the early pioneers. I think a lot of us don't realize how hard it was. The word profits was kind of still a dirty word in China. They didn't, if a company made money, they thought that the company was exploiting them. But if a company doesn't make money, there's no point in them being there. So there was this tension, and it was clear even at the time, and I wrote about this too, that what the U.S. companies wanted was access to the huge market. Now, of course, they were very poor at the time, so there were a lot of people, but it was still a huge market. And the Chinese side, they were super clear at the time that the only reason they were interested in foreign investment is that they wanted access to U.S. technology. They were very open about it, and they wanted joint ventures and not direct foreign investment 100% because they wanted to have some control over. They wanted access to the technology that these foreign companies brought. Now, at that time, of course, it was yesterday's technology. So it was much easier for companies to go in. They could bring in yesterday's technology, and it was a huge leap for China. So it wasn't so hard for them to make that decision to invest, although it was really hard on the ground because the rules were changing. Before this, it was illegal to invest in China. And so they had to create the laws and the rules and the regulations as they went along, which made it really difficult. But as you're right, as you point out, the U.S. business, especially big corporations, were cheerleaders for the U.S.-China relationship, particularly in the late 90s and the run-up to the WTO accession and after that as well. And as someone who worked for the U.S.-China Business Council, it was a time when those big corporations that I had been covering were very, very upbeat on China and really pushing to get more and more open trade and investment. And so it was kind of a shock in the last 5 years to realize that atmosphere had changed and that a lot of U.S. companies no longer felt so positive about China. And the easy way to look at that is to say that in the beginning, China was very poor, and it was a lot of, in the 90s and 2000s, I think a lot of the attitude was China was like a little brother, and we were helping the little brother along to try to get more and more modern. But China is no longer a little brother, and so we have to figure out a new relationship. We're no longer, there's some aspects of competition in the relationship now that weren't there before.
Great. Following that up, you wrote your first big book was about Starbucks and the company, and I think you were writing about it, not focusing on its role in China, but since then it's obviously become hugely successful in China, and I just wonder if you think Starbucks has a lesson for other American companies or not, and what their outlook might be now in China.
Well, when I wrote the book, they weren't yet in China. They had just started going overseas. They started in Japan, but now they have this huge international business. And when they first went into China, they were very hesitant going into China at first because it wasn't an easy place for a retailer. And also the Chinese are tea drinking people. A lot of people said, oh, they're never going to take to American style coffee. That's or even Italian style coffee. They're not interested in that. And the absolute huge success of Starbucks in China really took Starbucks by surprise. It's definitely their, far and away, their biggest foreign market. And in a way, they're a little bit insulated from current U.S.-China tension because they operate within China. So they're not an exporter to China or an importer from China. So they're not subject to tariffs and trade. They operate within China as a retailer and source a lot of their products within China. So I think they won't be hit as hard as a lot of other companies. Of course, everybody was hit during COVID because nobody could go out and get a cup of coffee. But I think that they'll come through this better than a lot of American companies.
Great. I'm going to ask one more question for now, but other questions are coming in. So I just can't resist. I noticed a line in your prologue that said, what a fluke of fate it is to feel the world tilt on its axis and throw you off balance, insisting that you rethink all of your well-polished assumptions. And I'm thinking about SAIS students now, and they're looking into the future, all of the uncertainties. You were looking at a new world opening up and took some brave steps yourself. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts for SAIS students studying China now.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that one. I think the world is tilting on its axis again, at least in terms of U.S.-China relations. Absolutely, these last 2 years, and particularly this year. It's sometimes there's opportunity when those kinds of things happen. And of course, there was great opportunity for me at that time because we were tilting towards better U.S.-China relations. The U.S.-China relations had been really terrible and hostile for many decades. So it's much harder for them, obviously, because U.S.-China relations are at a low point right now. But if to the extent that there is a turnaround, we don't know how long it will take. I think that I tend to try to be optimistic anyway, and I think that there will be a turn. It will not be the same relationship it was. So those studying foreign policy and politics in China will be watching very carefully for this new kind of relationship, which is more of a strategic competitor than before. But I think that there are some basic. The market is still huge. If you talk to the American car companies and luxury good companies and Disney and Starbucks and others, there's a huge consumer market in China. So in terms of business especially, there's definitely an exciting future potentially in China, depending on how things go in the U.S.-China relationship. And also, I think in scholarship and diplomacy, this is a really key time to get really smart SAIS graduates involved or other people who have a great deal of understanding of China. I think currently in our government, we have some people who don't know China very well and perhaps have misjudged China in some ways. And it's a time, I hope, if there is a new administration, that there will be a lot of renewed interest in expertise. And it's going to be a difficult relationship to manage. We're not going back to the same kind of engagement that we had before. It's going to be a different kind of engagement. It's not a little brother anymore. They're much more an equal basis. And we as the Americans have to, in other aspects of our policy, have to look to take care of to protect some of our own technology edge, which we've taken for granted all this time. And there are other kinds of policies as well that we need to think about in terms of making sure that we do maintain the edge that we have.
I appreciate your answer because we, here in Washington, we can get so caught up in the latest headlines and the latest partisan issues. And I think the perspective that you're bringing to this issue is really helpful. to be reminded of. We're talking about a massive relationship and set of dependencies and history that is bigger than just what is in the headlines this last few weeks or months or years. But anyway, you in part answered a question here from a student in the audience, but I'm going to give you a chance just to see if you want to elaborate a little bit. She said, given the state, and this is from Natalie Craig, by the way, given the state of US-China relations right now, do you see fields or opportunities where there can be cooperation instead of competition?
Well, that's a great question, and I think that it's very clear that in controlling pandemics, in nuclear nonproliferation, in climate change, there is a very, very strong need for cooperation rather than competition. And I hope that in the future, U.S. policy will focus on the need for cooperation in those areas. As well as balancing out some of, protecting some of our own interests in other areas. So absolutely, there are areas of cooperation that are essential, and it really depends on the policy we get from Washington as to how much they'll be valued in the future. But I'm hoping that they will be.
Good. Now, let me go to a question from an old friend and classmate, well-known China scholar and professor David Shambaugh. And he says, this is your SAIS classmate, David Shambaugh, a wonderful memoir. I've read it cover to cover. My question relates to your reporting for Businessweek. Whereas many of your contemporaries in the foreign correspondent world bounced around from one publication to another, many wrote for newspaper dailies or wire services. So my question is, why did you stay with Businessweek all the time and not leap to the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, etc.? And how did reporting for a business magazine affect your reporting?
Well, thanks, David. I have fond memories of being a fellow student with him at SAIS, and I'm honored by the question. I stayed with Businessweek because Businessweek was good to me. And they gave me amazing opportunities. As Madeline said, I was only 28 years old, and they made me a bureau chief. And I was actually covering not just China, but Southeast Asia, which is a big beat, as you can imagine. And they were wonderful to me. And really, I had a lot of mentors and guides, not in Hong Kong. I had to invent the wheel myself because it was a one-person bureau, and I didn't have anyone locally who could help me with sources. But the ones who were back in New York were really, really great to me. And there were a couple times when I was approached by other magazines and newspapers, and I said no, and it was kind of out of loyalty. But in terms of business, I do believe that I had a very different experience as a journalist covering China because I was covering business. And this really was brought home to me about a year and a half ago when the Overseas Press Club had a conference in New York commemorating Tiananmen Square and on one of the big anniversaries. And many of the other journalists there who had covered Tiananmen Square had a very different perspective than I did. And one of the reasons is that well, first of all, I was based in Hong Kong, which is an easier place to live. Some of the people who lived in Beijing in the 80s had a rather negative view, and because it was such a hard place to live. But also, I was assigned to cover business, U.S.-China business, but also entrepreneurship and private enterprise, which was booming in China at the time. So the stories that I was covering by nature were ones that were fairly positive. So I wasn't interviewing dissidents. I wasn't trying to dig up details on the political situation, although of course the political situation affects the business situation. But because of that, I didn't have the really negative interactions with the Communist Party that other journalists had. And they had them for good reason. I mean, there was a good reason that they had those conflicts, but just by nature, because I was covering something that at the time was a fairly positive subject, I had ended up with a more positive view, I think, of China than some others might have.
Okay, great. Now here's a question from another old friend. This is from James Stepanek, who I think you and I both wrote for when he was editor of the China Business Review. Jim says, hello, Dori. Did you go back to China in the 1990s, and what were your impressions? It was delightful hearing your story.
Well, it's delightful knowing that you're there, Jim. Yes, he was my editor at the China Business Review and edited all those early articles when I was cutting my teeth there. So in the 1990s, that's a great question. I came back in 1990, and my career switched to U.S. business and coverage of Starbucks and other companies in the U.S. But my husband, Paul, after the Deng Xiaoping had his Southern tour and kind of reopened reforms and it became more possible to do U.S.-China business again, represented a U.S. company in selling to China. So he was still based in Seattle, but he traveled all over China. And during the 90s and into the 2000s, and also because we had gotten to know some of his cousins who were actually born after his family left, we ended up being very close to them. And I traveled over to China quite a lot, probably every year or two during those years. And both to travel to parts of China I'd never been to before, because as a business journalist, you couldn't go to Gansu and a lot of these places where there wasn't much business. So I went as a tourist to see some of these more distant places, but also really continued to get an inside look into what China looked like from perspective of ordinary citizens, because we got to be very close with his relatives. So I was able to keep up with China and go there very frequently. In fact, we had a trip planned for April of this year. So we were going to go to Hong Kong and Beijing and Shanghai and several other places. And as you know, you can't go to China right now. So it's unfortunate, because I think people-to-people relationships are very, very important. And with no tourism and very limited exchange of students, a lot of those people-to-people relationships are not going to be happening.
So another related question comes here from Professor Andrew Murtha, who is Vice Dean and Director of our China Studies program at SAIS now. Wonderful presentation. I would like to ask you to contextualize further your thoughts that China would be moving backward after 1989. I lived in China 88, 89, and again 91 to 94. I recall the post-Tiananmen and pre-Southern tour period as particularly dark in terms of bilateral relations, prospects for reform, and the general upward trajectory that had been a cautious fact of life in the 80s for Chinese. At least for me, living in moribund Shanghai, but visiting my fiance in Beijing, where things were even darker. How does that time compare to the time we find ourselves in today? If worse, how much and why? What words of wisdom, a lot of questions to unpack, might you offer to SAIS students entering the fray?
I think that's an excellent question and an excellent thing to remember. It's one of the reasons I think it's important to look at history, recent history of the US and PRC and what was going on. It was a very, very dark period. As I said, I totally lost hope and left. And those who were there, as you were, could see just how negative and how dark it was. And it really did seem like there was no hope. And I have often felt in the last year or so that there is no hope for US-China relations. I think we're in a similar kind of negative period where it just doesn't seem like there's any hope. So I think those like you and I who have that historical perspective can say that with no certainty, of course, but it seems likely that we'll pull out again. One of the things about that Pomfret quote that really struck me is that Americans are passionate about China. We either love it or hate it. I mean, it's interesting because our relationship with India, well, whatever. I mean, a lot of different countries, we Americans don't have such a passionate attachment to. And I think one reason it gets so dark and then gets so euphoric is just that whatever we're feeling about China, we feel it in extremes. So we're in another set of extremes now. Whether it's worse or better is hard to say. I would say it was probably worse then, because in every aspect, U.S.-China relations, U.S.-China business, where even the reforms, and it seemed that the reforms were dead in the water. And in terms of openness, people were feeling very uncomfortable and not being open. In some ways it was worse then than it is now, but which isn't to say that it's good now. I mean, obviously we're seeing the Communist Party step up its control of a lot of different businesses and other organizations. We're seeing not just U.S.-China relations because of decisions made in Washington, but also some changes in China in terms of their policy toward their own people that is different than it was certainly in the late 90s and early 2000s, when things were it felt like they were getting more and more open. And then in the 90s, the internet was wide open in China, and it took a while for them to start closing it down. So we're seeing kind of a dark time, but I don't think it's as dark as it was back then.
Again, that perspective is interesting. Here's a question from an old China hand, David Brown, who's emeritus professor at SAIS. He taught our course on China and Taiwan relations for many years. He says, I was in the embassy following economic policy from 1981 to 83. When I left in 83, I was uncertain of how long Deng's reforms would last. We saw recurring opposition from leftists who resisted reform. 2 years later, in 85, you were very optimistic. What happened that made you clearer that reforms would continue?
That's wonderful to hear that perspective. Thank you so much for that question. One of the things I write about in the book, because I covered every twist and turn of U.S.-China relations and what was going on in China. So there was the spiritual pollution campaign. There was the anti-bourgeois liberalization campaign. There were times in the 80s when it seemed that the forces that were pulling China backward were kind of reasserting themselves. One thing that's interesting to remember is that Deng Xiaoping was not a dictator. There were other leaders who could rein him in from time to time. I don't think those campaigns were his idea. So he had to balance various factions within the government. And so 1983, 84, there were some worrisome concerns. And the two steps forward, one step back was definitely true throughout the 80s. When it seemed, I mean, the euphoria and despair were kind of cycling on a yearly basis back then. It's kind of like manic depressive. And in 85, 84 was some pundit said it was a glorious year for Deng Xiaoping. It was a great year. Things went really well. China became self-sufficient in food, and the spiritual pollution campaign kind of fizzled, and things got better in 84. And I wrote that in early 85. But then some discontents came up. So there was a lot of back and forth even in the 80s. And it's worth remembering that, because it's easy to say, oh, Deng Xiaoping started the reforms in 1978, and then it's been, and you look at the growth numbers, and the economic growth has been great overall since then. But there were definitely a lot of steps backward, and a lot of times when it wasn't all that clear, not just in the 80s, but later as well. That's a great historical perspective. I appreciate that.
Just thinking on your answer, I lived in Shanghai in 1979-80, and I went there in a period of real openness and euphoria, and was just every time I walked down on the street, people wanted to talk and make friends. And just during those 12 months, I experienced that kind of swing. And in early 1980, many of the contemporary authors that I was reading about and studying were suddenly silenced and weren't writing anymore. And the journals that we were able to buy on the street in Shanghai were not available anymore. So, you know, it really was sometimes almost a year to year thing, back and forth.
That's a great perspective. And I think a lot of us don't remember Democracy Wall and China Spring. It seemed in, what was that, 1980, was it, or 81, when they were, ordinary people were writing big character posters and posting them on the wall in Beijing. And then it was all shut down. And even US-China trade deals that had been signed were canceled for a while. And so there was also a period of despair right around then, 80, 81 or so, right before I got there. So there were definitely swings back and forth even then.
Very big swings. When people say this is just from today's perspective, that China policies sort of been directed from the start as a march toward domination, and I have to say that it hasn't been what I've observed. We have a question here from a student. Where did it just jump to? Bo Chen Han, one of our China Studies students who's now studying in Bologna this semester. And she asks, in which fields or sectors do you see the most need for China experts given US-China relations? You've addressed that a little bit, but the second part of her question you haven't really covered. As a journalist on the ground in such an opaque country, how did you manage your frustration with the misconceptions that people back in the West had? Did you ever feel an obligation to correct them?
That's a really great question. And to your point, Madeline, about the China, China is not a juggernaut. It's not, its continued growth is not at all guaranteed. I think that Chinese leaders are very, very aware there's a huge migrant problem, there's debt. They know what some of the vulnerabilities are. And the idea that they're going to just keep growing forever, it's not necessarily going to happen unless they really get a handle on some of their own problems. But a really great question about misconceptions about, I guess, misconceptions of Americans have of China. And that was, as I said, one of the biggest frustrations that I had because, and that I have today, frankly, when I read some of the American press. But I understand where it's coming from, which is, I was told by my editors, Americans don't know much about China. You need to really simplify it and make it very clear and put it in context. And sometimes when my editors would do that in New York, they would cut out some of the other points of view. And what I think that one of the biggest misconceptions is that a lot of Americans just don't understand what the world looks like to China and why they focus on stability. For instance, we haven't really gotten to Hong Kong that much, but when Deng Xiaoping first started the one country, two systems idea, and when they were just starting their discussions about the future of Hong Kong after 1997, he talked a lot about his goal for Hong Kong was stability and prosperity. And I remember at the time thinking, whoa, what's that all about? But he didn't promise freedom and democracy. And I think today we have this kind of in America, this sense that, well, yes, they promised freedom and democracy, and why aren't they doing that? And what he promised was stability and prosperity. But one thing as Americans, we don't really understand stability, the importance of stability very much, because our country's been stable for a long time. I mean, it may not seem so in the last 3 or 4 years, but it really has been amazingly stable compared to Chinese history over the last 100 years. We haven't been invaded. We haven't had civil war. We haven't had a government that couldn't even control the country. They know what that feels like when the country doesn't have a strong central government and isn't stable. And that really is what I think, more than communism, gives them a different perspective. And it's hard to explain that to Americans. They really don't want to hear it, because we have different values, and we have different values because we have a different history. So I'm hoping that you and other SAIS students will help to explain America to China and explain China to America. That is super, super important work that you're going to be doing in your careers. And I think I applaud you. And I'm really glad that we've got such a smart generation coming up doing that.
I think we can't finish today without touching a little bit more on Hong Kong, and a few of our questions relate to that. You were based in Hong Kong throughout the 80s. You took part in some marches in Hong Kong around the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown. So what parallels, if any, do you see with Hong Kong today and what's happening there now with the new national security law and China's, grab back of power?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really good question too. And yes, in 1989, after the crackdown on Tiananmen Square, there was also a huge street demonstration in Hong Kong, which was definitely the biggest demonstration ever up until last year. And there was an even bigger one, or there were several, but one in particular was even bigger than that one. And my husband and I put our little baby on our shoulder and marched in the street. And we taught our 2-year-old to say "Minju wan sui." And one of the first sentences that she learned is certainly the first Chinese sentence that she learned. And so I definitely felt a sense of solidarity when those protests started. But when I was there, the protests were peaceful. And as in the U.S., when protests turn violent, people have somewhat of a different opinion. And I think the question about Hong Kong and its future goes back to what I was saying about what Deng was hoping for, and what the Chinese government kind of set as their goal was stability and prosperity. And when you look at what was happening in Hong Kong a year ago, it was definitely not stability, right? And it was kind of a shock, of course, to Beijing that Hong Kong got so unstable. I think another thing a lot of Americans don't recall, although I'm sure most of you know, when Hong Kong was under British rule, they did not have democracy. They had freedom. They had an amazing freedom. The British were very hands-off on a lot of things, but they didn't have democracy. They were foreigners ruling Hong Kong for 150 years. But toward the end, they introduced some democracy and they introduced some elections. And so the British really raised the hopes that there might be more democracy, and they got some of them written into the basic law. So it's very unfortunate. The national security law it's depressing to see that there's a lot less freedom of speech and a lot less freedom of the press, certainly in Hong Kong now. But I do think that for those who were activists and demonstrators, it's a really bad time, obviously. But Hong Kong has always been mainly about business, and I think that business, the Chinese built that sea bridge over from Hong Kong to Macau. They're really focusing on this so-called Greater Bay Area. I think that for business, Hong Kong will continue to be a center, and their economy probably will pick back up and won't be hit so hard. So it's kind of a good things for the economy, not so good for the activists. But I'm hopeful for Hong Kong.
I certainly hope you're right. Many Sicers are watching with bated breath what's happening. I think we've unfortunately reached 1 o'clock. So I will close by saying this has just been delightful, and I think very interesting for the SAIS community. Thank you, and let me give you a chance to say anything you'd like, and we'll close.
Well, thanks so much, Madeline. And I'm just honored that you're all here, and hope that you enjoyed the talk and perhaps the book. And it's fun to be back, even though it's only virtually. So thanks very much for the invitation.
Maybe we can get you back in person after this year.
I hope so. I hope so. That'd be great.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Bye.